check in with The West Beyond the West, Chapter 11, The Best and Worst of Times, 1918 to 1945. One of a series of what I kind of like giant compendium chapters, which seem like they should be divided into like two or three chapters each. Let's start off with chapter 11. At least that's what I'm assuming chapter 12 will be. So this is 1918 to 1945. So sort of boom time post World War One, up until the Great Depression, and then we get the Great Depression, and then we get World War II, bringing us out of the Depression. So yeah, I mean, we get kind of a boom time, overinflation after war. Again, a kind of another thing of it's boom times. We'll just spend and we'll do stuff. And like there's going to be no tomorrow. There won't be any downturn in the big international markets that we are all now connected to, especially as a resource province, a province that basically depends on international and domestic markets over in the Ontario and Quebec and the East to buy our stuff. And when they don't buy our stuff, we're screwed. Which gets us into the Great Depression, hitting in 1929. BC doesn't really start feeling the effects until like 1930, 31, when demands for the staples that we're producing, the lumber, the mining, the fisheries, all just completely plummets. And at that point, our government is a conservative government under Ptolemy, who it's very much kind of the conservative thing of the day of like, small government should be kind of fiscally responsible. We shouldn't actually run deficits or anything like that. We should run this like a business. At the very dying days of the Ptolemy government, before they do get tossed out in favor of the Liberals, is they commission a kid report, which is a bunch of business guys who say, yeah, let's cut spending, eliminate all this stuff. We should claw back any social programs and stuff we've just nascently started, which it ends up. I mean, Ptolemy government takes a big step away from that, but it's too late. People are like, you are doing nothing. And the Liberal government under Duff Patullo comes in, who is very much more kind of allied with sort of the idea of like kind of FDR, the New Deal of let's spend to get people into work and stuff like that. This is fueled by the rise of the CCF, See, I've completely forgotten their little acronym now. Little acronym. We'll leave that. The CCF, which is basically in Canada, is the left leaning kind of social programs, socialist-ish programs. They have a rise in both the federal and in the provincial, and indeed in the provincial, with the election that brings in Patullo, it also brings in the CCF as the official opposition at like 7 members, which to the 39 or whatever of the Liberals under Patullo. There's a lot of stuff that is tried during this time. They're trying to do like kind of cooperative boards, marketing boards, stuff like that, where you're like, okay, we're all going to agree to sell, like whether it's in dairy or in the orchards and stuff like that. We're going to try and agree on a price to sell stuff. This often gets undermined by individuals who, for either necessity or just like want the cash right now, to kind of undercut that. So that has limited effect. There's a lot of political unrest because there is a ton of especially young males who don't have a job. And indeed, British Columbia, because of its milder climate, actually attracts more and more of those people. And there's lots of sounding off of, how is BC, what share of the federal funding and stuff like that should BC actually get? And there's a lot of back and forth with that. It's definitely one of these things where you look at it and you think, reading this book is like, it's striking that it's like, oh, all the guys who are in these work camps and like, are able to band together. These white guys were actually, that's the privileged class, because you look at how women and racial minorities fared in at this time, and they actually had it a lot worse off. Women oftentimes weren't given denied relief because it's like, well, you're a woman. It's like, you've got a good enough figure, you shouldn't have to worry about that. And or and so you end up with a lot of women, it's like, it's prostitution, it's starving as individuals versus being able to band together like a lot of the men did. People, if you're Chinese and stuff like that, you weren't a lot, you couldn't go to one of these relief work camps, which probably had as one thing, but you're also expected to survive on a third of the assistance that the guys in work camps were given. So great, you get racially discriminated against even when you're completely down on your luck. Um, you get a lot of political unrest. There's Regina riots. There is in BC, there's the occupation in Vancouver of the main post office, the art gallery, and the Hotel Georgia, where there was basically kind of riot clashes with police all the way up and down, with over 100 wounded, 22 arrested. Um, you know, it's not a great time. I think they talked about like 1 in 3, and then 1 in 4, and then 1 in 3 males, probably white males, were actually unemployed during this time. There was this definitely did push the shift of a lot more kind of political pressure of, we need to have government within in our society to actually provide basic social amenities, to try and, like, so that people aren't completely starving to death. And indeed, before, in the full height of the Great Depression, there wasn't those supports, and people were just lost on their own at that. And so that did make this big push, which, you reflected with FDR, but also in British Columbia with Pattullo. It's also a time the radio comes to the frontier, where it's more connecting the kind of the further outreaches of British Columbia to the rest of the world in like 1937. So this goes along, and it was, didn't show any signs of actually letting up, but World War One, the war is declared in 1939, which, like World War Two and World War One, like World War One, it revs up the economy. Suddenly, we're getting more industrialization. Like World War One industrialized Canada. This further does that. Further focuses it. Further integrates it into our thing. More women going into the workforce, obviously, because a lot of men of working age are off as soldiers. Unions, unlike in World War One, world unions became part of the war effort as cooperative, and it became their kind of their heyday. They grew a lot, and they had a lot more influence and stuff like that. This shows one of the big horrible bits of Canadian history up there with how we treated Native peoples, is that especially with its, and focuses especially on BC, is there was tons of paranoia about Canadians of Japanese descent who lived on the coast, and lots of paranoia, there was going to be an invasion. Turns out the Japanese had no plans on invading the coast, but we didn't know it at the time, and took a lot of Canadians who just happened to be of that descent, and said, no, we are going to take them 160-kilometer strip along the coast, and move them into camps. At first, it was only males, but that did not satisfy the public sentiment at the time, the racist public sentiment at the time, and so all families were pulled up. There's notes here of, taken to be processed at Vancouver Hastings Park, where the stables and cattle pens were used to hold Japanese families, basically treated like animals. It's the cattle cars and stuff like that. You think about that as just the kind of the worst sort of stuff, and shipped either to the interior of British Columbia, where they suffered really hard winters, where children weren't educated. Meanwhile, their land was sold off. They were not compensated for this. It was only not until 1988 that the Canadian government actually apologized for this and tried to offer some kind of a financial restitution for all the property and land stolen from these people who were Canadians, who were just Canadians who, because of very latent racism, historical racism that had gone back, as we've seen in this book, hundreds of years, were treated like shit. Yeah, yeah. It was, and yeah, and by the end of this, I think it's like 4,000 Canadian Japanese Canadians, they just left the country at the end of this. Yeah, with the war's conclusion in September 1945, many had a change of heart about wanting to be repatriated. In the end, forced deportations were abandoned. About 4,000 evacuees, over half Canadian-born, left Canada voluntarily with federal assistance. So, were obviously so disgusted and betrayed by Canada that they didn't even stay here. They left. It's interesting. I'll read this. It's the final paragraph of this kind of Dog's Breakfast chapter, because it's taking such a wide period. Japanese evacuation was in many ways only the tip of a much larger iceberg. Across British Columbia, inequities abounded during the interwar years and through the Second World War. Class, race, and ethnicity and gender circumscribed opportunities. The urban-rural dichotomy probably widened as Vancouver became the metropolis to a vast hinterland extending into the prairies. The jolt provided by the Depression caused serious reflection in some quarters, as evidenced by the CCF's formation, but it took another war to awaken British Columbians to the anomalies so long accepted as the way things were, and therefore ought to be. I'll start off with Japanese evacuation. It wasn't an evacuation. We weren't ripping these people from their homes for their own protection. It's like internal deportation, internal, brutalization. It was not an evacuation of except in the very most kind of technical terms. It's a very kind of I find this chapter kind of, I wish it had been divvied up into smaller chapters. I can see that this is probably where you get the feeling of like, this is a textbook, and we have so many weeks in the so many months in a school year, and we need to cram all this stuff in. So we're going to put it all in one chapter to go by. Yeah. So there were parts that I just kind of, to be honest, I kind of glazed over in this one. Wasn't the strongest of chapters for me. But at least kind of detailing Japanese internment is probably the better way. Internment during the war, illegal internment. Of course, with all sorts of stuff like this, totally illegal, totally against the thing, but completely upheld by courts and accepted by the majority of Canadians at the time. Only a couple of, I think they note that there was a couple of, only 3 UBC scholars objected to disqualifications imposed in terms of race, which meant that they applied equally to the second generation born in Canada, educated in Canadian schools, and in many cases, thoroughly Canadian in outlook. Yeah, just a really, really, we think of, there's a lot of kind of things of like, oh, World War II is the good war. We're fighting against the fascists. At the same time, being horribly racist towards a hunk of our own population at the same time, and using camps as the tool to go after men, women, and children in that process, and obviously seriously disrupt, destroy lives. So yeah, that is chapter 11, The Best and Worst of Times. And next time we will do another rather huge chapter, The Good Life, 1945 to 1972. More videos later.